The river was louder than thunder that morning, and when he saw the mother bear leap in with her cubs, the ranger knew something was wrong. One cub was missing. And it was still out there, clinging to a rock in the middle of the flood. The mountain river had always been loud, but that morning, it was deafening, a surge of snowmelt crashing down the valley like a living thing. Ranger Eli Moran tightened his jacket and scanned the white-capped current through his binoculars. Spring thaw always made the forest unpredictable, but something about today felt off. The air was colder than it should have been, the water level too high, the smell of pine and danger mingling in the mist. He was used to bears, had seen dozens over the years patrolling this park. He respected them, admired them even. But that morning, as he followed fresh paw prints near the river's edge, he noticed something strange. They were smaller than usual, cubs, 2 of them judging by the pattern. He crouched, brushing the damp soil with his fingers. The prints led straight to the sound of rushing water. That's when he saw her. A mother grizzly stood at the riverbank, muscles taut beneath her wet fur, her breath steaming in the morning cold. She paced, growled low, and then, to his shock, she plunged into the torrent. Eli froze. Behind her, 2 cubs hesitated, whining at the water's edge. The river was too wild, the current too fast, but the mother didn't hesitate. She was after something. Something beyond the current. Eli raised his binoculars again and saw it. A 3rd cub, smaller, stranded on a slippery boulder midstream. The rock was barely above water, and the cub clung to it, crying out in panicked squeals lost beneath the roar. The mother bear fought to reach it, but every step dragged her sideways. She wasn't going to make it. Eli's instincts warred inside him. He'd been trained never to interfere. Nature had its rules. But this wasn't some quiet forest tragedy. This was a mother fighting for her child, and every second counted. He looked around. No bridge, no rope, nothing nearby but his truck parked up the trail. The cub slipped. Its paw lost hold for a second, then scrambled back up. Eli's heart kicked hard. He grabbed his radio. "Base, this is Ranger Moran at North Ridge. Got a bear family in distress. Repeat, a cub stranded mid-river. Requesting guidance." Static. No answer. The storm last night must have fried the line. He glanced back at the river. The mother bear was roaring now, frantic. 1 cub on the bank was crying too, pacing the mud helplessly. The smallest cub, still on the rock, looked weaker by the minute, soaked through, shivering. Eli muttered under his breath, "All right, easy now, think." He found a fallen log nearby, thick, heavy, but long enough to span part of the current. It wouldn't reach the rock, but it might get him halfway. He shoved it toward the water, wedged one end into the mud, and tested his weight on it. It creaked dangerously. Behind him, the 2nd cub squealed again. The mother roared louder, not at him but at the storm, the water, the unfairness of it all. For a moment Eli locked eyes with her across the river, and something passed between them. Not threat. Not rage. Desperation. A plea. He took a step onto the log. The world narrowed to the sound of rushing water and the tiny cries of the cub. The current sprayed his face, his boots slipping, his heartbeat sinking with the roar of the river. He was halfway across now, every muscle tight, every nerve screaming. And then, behind him, a branch cracked, the sound of movement in the woods. Something, or someone, was there watching him. Who, or what, was watching the ranger in that tense moment? Eli froze, one boot balanced on the trembling log. The sound had come from behind him, crisp, deliberate, and close. He slowly turned his head toward the tree-line, every instinct sharpened. The forest was quiet except for the roar of the river and the wind cutting through the pines. Then another crack, heavier this time. Not a branch falling. Step. Through the mist, a dark shape moved between the trees. For a moment Eli thought it might be another bear, maybe a wandering male drawn by the scent of the mother and her cubs. His pulse spiked. A territorial male grizzly was the last thing anyone wanted near this scene. They were unpredictable, dangerous. One wrong move and everything, the cub, the mother, even Eli, could end in chaos. The mother bear saw it too. She let out a deep, guttural growl that made Eli's skin prickle. She was no longer just panicked. She was defensive now, eyes darting between the forest and her stranded cub. The river roared between them, but her attention was divided. Eli raised his hand slowly, speaking in a low voice that no one could hear but himself. "Stay with me, girl. Focus on your cub. Don't turn your back on him." The shadow shifted again and through the branches emerged a deer. Eli exhaled a long breath, almost laughing in disbelief. A small doe, trembling and wet, had wandered near the noise, curious about the commotion. For a heartbeat, predator and prey locked eyes. the bear on one side, the deer on the other, before the doe bolted into the underbrush, leaving silence in her wake. Eli turned back to the river, but the distraction had cost them time. The cub was sliding again, its claws barely gripping the mossy stone. The water level had risen just enough that every wave splashed its face, soaking it further. The mother was pacing along the bank, roaring louder, snapping branches in frustration. "Hang in there, little one," Eli murmured. He inched forward another few feet along the log, water lapping against his boots. He knew this was dangerous. One slip and he'd be in the current himself. The roar, the spray, the smell of cold metal and pine, everything screamed at him to stop. But that cub's cry was too human, too desperate. He reached for a nearby branch hanging low from an overhanging pine, broke it, and stretched it forward like a makeshift pole. "Come on, just grab on," he whispered as if the cub could understand. The cub's tiny paw reached toward it, missing once, twice. It was trembling so hard it could barely lift its head. Then, from behind him, another sound, this time the unmistakable rumble of rocks shifting. Eli turned just in time to see part of the riverbank give way upstream, unleashing a surge of frothy water. It slammed against the log beneath him, jolting it violently. He dropped to his knees, gripping tight. The log lurched, half submerged now, water pushing against his legs. He tried to regain balance, but the pole slipped from his hands and was carried away by the current. The cub screamed, a sharp, high sound, as the rock beneath it shifted too. Eli's heart seized. He didn't think. He leapt from the log toward the cub. The cold hit him like a wall of knives. The world became bubbles and white water. He kicked hard, arms thrashing, trying to surface. When he burst up again, gasping, he saw the cub just a few feet away, flailing. The current was dragging them both downstream. Eli fought to stay upright, one hand reaching out, and miraculously the cub's paw brushed his glove. He grabbed it, pulling it close against his chest. The little creature squirmed, coughing and squealing, but alive. He tried to reach the log again, but it was gone, swept away. The river was carrying them both fast toward the bend where the current deepened, and the sound ahead was unmistakable. A waterfall. Could he reach the bank before the drop, or would the river take them both? The roar of the waterfall grew louder, not like thunder anymore but like a living beast breathing down his neck. Eli's arms burned from the weight of the cub, but he clutched it tight, refusing to let go. Every stroke forward felt useless against the pull of the river. The current was faster now, swirling, dragging them both toward the bend that curved into the gorge. "Hold on, little one," he gasped, water slapping his face, voice breaking through the storm. The cub whimpered, small, breathy sounds muffled by wet fur and cold water. Its claws had tangled in his jacket, as though it somehow understood he was its only chance. Ahead, through the mist, he caught a glimpse of the drop, a violent torrent where white water vanished into a narrow crevice. There was no way down that would leave them alive. He scanned the sides, steep, mossy rocks on both ends, slick as glass. He needed a foothold, anything. Then he saw it. A fallen pine jammed diagonally across two rocks near the bank, half submerged, half sticking out like a bridge of driftwood. It wasn't close, but it was their only hope. Eli turned his body, angling toward it, using his free arm to steer. The current fought him, spinning them sideways, forcing water into his eyes and mouth. His lungs burned. The cub's tiny chest heaved against his arm, its heart pounding fast, so fast he could feel it through his sleeve. "Just a little more," he grunted. "Come on, come on." Every second was a battle. The current slammed him into something hard, a submerged rock, and pain shot through his ribs. He didn't stop. He wrapped his other arm around the cub, holding it higher above the water. The waterfall's edge was only a dozen feet away now. The roar filled everything. The fallen pine was just to his right, close enough to reach. He took a deep breath, stretched out one arm and grabbed it. Bark tore at his glove, but he had a grip. The cub slipped in his other arm, squealing. He swung it up, managing to press it onto the log. It clung to the wood instinctively, claws digging deep. Now he had to get himself up. His legs were being pulled by the current, half his body already below the log. He tried to haul himself over, but his boots were heavy, waterlogged. He kicked hard, gripping tighter, when suddenly a section of the log cracked with a deafening snap. The world tilted. He and the cub slid together, spinning, half submerged again. The waterfall was seconds away. Eli made a split-second decision. He shoved the cub upward with all his strength, hurling it toward the part of the log still attached to the rocks. The cub landed awkwardly, scrambling but finding purchase. Eli, though, lost his hold completely. The current yanked him backward, and in an instant he was swept over the edge. Everything went white. The fall wasn't long, maybe 20 feet, but it felt endless. He crashed into icy water below, pain shooting through his shoulder and leg. For a moment he couldn't tell which way was up. Then instinct took over. He kicked toward the light above him, bursting out into chaos and air. He gasped, blinking through spray and foam. He was alive, barely. The cub was nowhere in sight. The waterfall thundered behind him, and downstream stretched a calmer pool surrounded by cliffs. He paddled toward it, dragging his body onto a slick, rocky shore. Every breath was fire. "Cub," he rasped, scanning the rocks above the waterfall. Nothing. Just mist and shadow. His head throbbed, vision blurring at the edges. He wanted to climb back, but his limbs felt like stone. Then faintly through the roar, a sound. Not water. Not wind. A cry. A high, desperate cub cry. He looked up through the mist. On the rocks above, he could just make out a small brown shape moving along the edge, limping but alive. Relief surged through him, so strong it almost hurt. He let out a weak laugh, half choked, half grateful. "You made it." But the moment of relief vanished just as quickly, because behind that cub, out of the trees, something massive was moving. Was it the mother coming back, or something far worse? Eli blinked through the mist, his vision swimming. The shape behind the cub was huge, heavier, darker, and moving slowly, deliberately. His first thought was relief. The mother bear had come back for her cub. But the longer he stared, the more uncertain he became. The silhouette was bulkier than the female's lean frame. Its shoulders rose higher, broader, the movement heavier, less cautious. Then it stopped, lifting its head toward the wind. Eli's gut twisted. He knew that stance. He'd seen it in trail footage dozens of times before. This wasn't the mother. It was a male grizzly. The cub turned toward the noise, freezing in place. The male let out a low, vibrating growl that carried across the gorge. The sound was primal, territorial. It didn't just echo through the forest, it crawled into Eli's bones. He knew what it meant. A cub that wasn't his was a threat, a rival's bloodline. "No," Eli whispered, forcing himself upright, every muscle protesting. His shoulders screamed from the fall, his legs scraped raw, but he couldn't stay still. He looked around for anything, a rock, a stick, something to make noise with, but the river had stripped the bank bare. His rifle was back at the truck, and the tranquilizer kit was lost somewhere upstream. The cub whimpered again, backing against the rocks. It was cornered, nowhere to go. The male grizzly took a few heavy steps forward, snout lowering, sniffing the air. Steam rose from its fur, catching the morning light. Its claws scraped the stone, a slow, deliberate sound that made Eli's stomach tighten. And then, like a miracle, another sound broke through, a roar deep and thunderous from the opposite side of the ridge. The mother. Her call rolled over the forest like an avalanche, shaking birds from the trees. Eli looked toward the treeline beyond the river, and there she was, soaked, panting, wild-eyed but alive. Her fur glistened with water and ice as she sprinted toward the sound of her cub. The male froze, head snapping up. The cub seized its moment, darting sideways along the rocks, slipping and tumbling but putting precious distance between itself and danger. The mother's growl deepened into something more primal, more furious. She was charging full speed toward the ridge. Eli could barely breathe. The scene before him was raw wilderness, instinct and survival colliding. The male reared on his hind legs, massive and terrible, bellowing in answer. He wasn't backing down. Eli had seen grizzlies fight before, on distant hills, through binoculars, never this close. The violence, the sheer power, it could tear trees apart. He knew he couldn't interfere directly, but if the cub was caught between them, it didn't stand a chance. He looked downriver. A narrow ledge wound around the gorge, climbing upward toward the ridge. It wasn't much, slick, broken stone barely wide enough for a boot, but it might get him close enough to reach the cub before the fight did. He started climbing. Every movement was agony. His leg throbbed where he'd hit the rocks and his shoulder felt like fire. But the thought of that helpless cry kept him moving. The river roared below, mist curling around him, blurring the world into light and shadow. Halfway up, he stopped to catch his breath, just in time to see the male charge. The impact echoed like thunder. The two bears collided, the ground shaking beneath them. Fur, claws, and sound exploded in a blur of motion. The cub bolted down the ridge, straight toward Eli's side of the gorge. Eli stretched his good arm forward, shouting over the roar of the fight. "Here. Come this way." The cub hesitated, terrified. Then it spotted him, the human who had pulled it from the river. For a fleeting instant it seemed to remember. It scrambled toward him, slipping and sliding on wet stone. Eli reached out inches away now, when another crack split the air. The ledge beneath him trembled, pebbles scattering into the void. He froze. The stone was breaking. One wrong move and both man and cub would fall back into the river below. The edge gives way. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, groaning crack, followed by a spray of loose gravel tumbling into the roaring river below. Eli froze mid-step, his body pressed against the cliff face. The cub was only a few feet away now, panting, its tiny claws scraping the wet stone in panic. The fight above raged on, the mother and the male locked in a brutal struggle of muscle and fury. But here, on this fragile edge, even a breath felt dangerous. "Easy, stay there," Eli whispered, his voice trembling. He could see the cub's wide, terrified eyes, pools of brown glistening with fear and exhaustion. He knew one wrong move would send them both tumbling into the gorge. His fingers gripped a protruding root jutting from the rock, slick with rain and moss. It held barely. Another rumble shook the ridge. He risked a glance upward and saw both bears rear up again, slamming into each other. The mother's roar carried across the valley, furious, desperate. The male's weight forced her back a step, claws swiping, blood streaking her fur. Eli had no time to think. The cub whimpered, stumbling closer, and that was it. The final crack split the ledge. It tilted sharply. Eli lunged, grabbing the cub with his good arm just as the world fell out from under them. The rock gave way with a grinding scream and suddenly they were in freefall. For a split second, the air rushed cold against his face, and he saw flashes of sky, water, and blinding white mist. Instinct took over. He twisted midair, cradling the cub to his chest, trying to shield it from the impact. They hit hard, not water but mud. A lower embankment on the far side of the gorge caught them, breaking the fall just enough. The wind knocked from his lungs. Eli gasped and rolled, keeping the cub close. They slid a few feet before stopping against a pile of wet roots and stones. Pain exploded through his shoulder again. The cub let out a sharp cry, frightened but alive. He coughed, spitting dirt, the world spinning. For a moment he couldn't tell which way was up. Then, through the haze, he realized something astonishing. They were closer to the forest floor now, just a short climb from the riverbank below. The fall, as brutal as it was, might have saved them both. He gently set the cub down. "You okay, buddy?" he murmured. The cub shook itself, dripping water, trembling but standing. Its tiny paw reached toward him, pressing lightly against his soaked sleeve, a gesture so human it almost broke him. Above them the roars continued, deeper now, more violent. Eli looked up to see the mother still locked with the male. They were dangerously close to the cliff's edge. The male had the advantage in size, forcing her backward. The cub whimpered, calling out, and for the first time the mother's gaze flicked downward, toward her baby. That one look changed everything. She let out a roar that was less anger and more something else, raw, primal love. Then she lunged forward with everything she had left, ramming the male with her full weight. The sound was catastrophic, a shattering crash, echoing like thunder through the valley. The male stumbled, claws scraping the rock, before tumbling over the ridge. He hit the river below with a heavy splash and vanished beneath the white water. Eli's breath caught. The mother stood panting on the ridge, sides heaving, her fur matted with blood and rain. She turned, searching frantically, and then she saw them. Her cub alive. The human beside it. The air went still. Eli stayed perfectly still, lowering his gaze, making himself small. He could feel her eyes on him, wild, unreadable. Every instinct told him to back away slowly, to let nature reunite on its own terms. But the cub didn't move. It just stood there, staring between them as if torn between two worlds. Finally, with a trembling breath, the mother began to descend, slow, deliberate steps down the ridge, never breaking eye contact. Each paw sank deep into the mud. Eli's heart pounded, but he didn't move. When she reached the base, she paused only a few feet away. Her size up close was staggering, a wall of fur, muscle, and presence. The cub whimpered softly and stepped forward. Eli exhaled shakily as the cub pressed its head into her chest. She lowered her snout, sniffing, confirming what instinct already knew. Her cub was alive. Then, for a fleeting second, she turned her head toward Eli, a look that wasn't rage or warning. It was something quieter. Recognition. And just as that fragile peace settled, a new sound split the air, the sharp crack of a rifle echoing from somewhere up the ridge. Who fired the shot, and were they aiming at the bear, or the ranger? He stood at the edge, staring into the churning silver water, the reflection of the cubs trembling in the ripples. The rain had stopped, but the river hadn't calmed. Its roar filled the valley, like an ancient warning. Ranger Cole's breath came in shallow bursts, his boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. Behind him, the cubs whimpered, their tiny growls sounding more like pleading than defiance. And in that sound, Cole heard something human, the desperate voice of fear mixed with hope. He looked across the river again. The mother grizzly was still there, massive, soaked, trembling with both exhaustion and resolve. She paced the far bank, grunting low, calling her cubs but not crossing back. The water between them was a monster, a living thing that swallowed branches whole. One wrong step could mean the end. Cole swallowed hard, his fingers brushing the tranquilizer rifle slung over his shoulder, a useless burden now. He wasn't a ranger with authority in this moment. He was a man watching a mother and her children separated by something beyond control. His training told him to stand back, to let nature decide. But his heart, it didn't care about manuals. Then one of the cubs, the smaller one with the lighter fur, stepped forward. Its paw dipped into the water, recoiling from the icy bite, then trying again. The current tugged at its leg and Cole's pulse spiked. The other cub whimpered, nudging it back, but the first cub pressed forward anyway. Brave or foolish, it didn't matter. It was just trying to reach its mother. Cole's instinct roared louder than the river. He waded in. The shock of the cold hit him like a wall, his breath seizing as water surged around his knees, then thighs. "Easy," he shouted, though to whom he didn't know. Maybe to himself. Maybe to the cubs. The mother on the other side reared up, roaring in alarm, her massive form blurred by mist and distance. The cub squealed as the current caught it, spinning it halfway downstream. Cole lunged, water splashing over his chest. His arms burned as he grabbed at a tiny scruff of fur, slick, trembling, alive. The cub thrashed, claws grazing his jacket, but he held on, pulling it toward him, stumbling back step by step until they both collapsed onto the muddy bank. The world went silent for a heartbeat. The other cub cried out, and before Cole could react, it too stepped into the water. The mother bellowed, pacing helplessly on the far shore. Cole didn't hesitate this time. He plunged back in, fighting the current, every muscle screaming. The river pushed him sideways, debris slamming against his legs, but he moved forward anyway, not because it made sense, but because something inside him refused to watch this story end in tragedy. When his hands finally closed around the second cub, it clung to him as if it somehow understood he wasn't a threat. Together they stumbled out again, coughing, shaking, drenched but alive. He set the cub beside its sibling, both shivering, and looked across the river. The mother grizzly's posture had changed. She was still watching but not pacing anymore. For a brief second her gaze met his. Not as a wild animal to a man but as one parent to another. There was no growl, no charge. Just a quiet recognition. Then against all odds she stepped into the water. She moved with the power of something born from this land, her shoulders cutting through the current. The river bucked, tried to swallow her whole, but she didn't waver. The sight rooted Cole in place, awe and fear mixing until he couldn't tell them apart. Step by step she crossed, water lashing around her, until she reached the opposite bank. The cubs squealed, running toward her, and the moment she touched shore, they pressed against her legs, whimpering with relief. Cole felt something break and rebuild inside him all at once. He turned away before she could look at him again, shoulders heavy, eyes burning. Behind him, the sound of the family reunited echoed through the valley, low, deep grunts, the language of forgiveness and survival. That river, once a barrier, had become something else, a test neither of them had expected but both had passed. And though Cole would never say it aloud, he knew what had truly changed that day wasn't just a family of bears. It was him. The morning after the crossing was eerily calm. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap, and a thin fog hung low over the river like a secret not ready to be spoken. Ranger Cole sat beside a small fire, the steam from his tin cup rising in lazy spirals. His clothes still damp, his body sore, he stared across the now peaceful water. You'd never guess that just yesterday, it had nearly swallowed them all whole. Behind him, faint rustles broke the silence. The mother grizzly and her cubs, resting a safe distance away. She no longer growled when he moved. She didn't flee or charge. Instead, she watched, occasionally lifting her head as if to check that the strange human who had shared their struggle was still near. Cole didn't pretend to understand it, but something wordless passed between them. He had spent years patrolling these lands, enforcing boundaries, humans here, wildlife there. But those lines had blurred in that river. He had crossed something invisible too, a threshold of trust that shouldn't have been possible. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, its pages damp and smudged. He always carried it, jotting down field notes, migration routes, feeding grounds, weather changes. But today he hesitated before writing. What could he even call what he saw? Grizzly family successfully crossed river after storm? No, that wasn't it. The truth was something less scientific and far more human. He finally scribbled, "Sometimes nature tests you not to break you, but to remind you you're a part of it." When he looked up, the smaller cub, the one he had first pulled from the river, was staring right at him. Its fur still matted, tiny eyes blinking, it tilted its head, then took a hesitant step closer. Cole froze, not wanting to spook it. The cub sniffed the air, then sat back down. A cautious peace. "Hey there," Cole whispered. "You made it." The mother grizzly stirred, chuffing softly, calling her cubs back. They obeyed, but not before glancing at him one last time, a small, almost childlike curiosity in their gaze. And when the family moved off toward the trees, Cole realized he wasn't watching a wild animal vanish into the wilderness. He was watching a story continue without him. Hours later, as the sun began to slide behind the ridges, Cole followed their trail from a respectful distance, not as a ranger enforcing boundaries but as a witness. He saw how the cubs stuck close to their mother, occasionally glancing back toward the river they had conquered. They weren't afraid anymore. Something in them had changed too. When they reached a fallen log bridge spanning a smaller creek, the cubs hesitated again. The water below was calmer, gentler, but the memory of the previous day's currents still lingered. The mother stepped first, slow and deliberate, her weight creaking the old wood. Then she paused midway and turned, looking at her cubs. It wasn't a command this time. It was an invitation. The first cub followed, paws shaking, claws scraping the bark. The second stayed behind, whining, looking between its mother and the water. Cole held his breath, every instinct telling him to stay silent. Then, slowly, bravely, the cub stepped forward. One paw, then another, until it crossed. When it reached the other side, Cole let out a quiet laugh that surprised even him. The sound echoed through the trees, startling a flock of sparrows into flight. For a moment, the forest itself seemed to breathe again. He realized, with a deep ache of wonder, that this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about lessons learned, theirs and his. The river had forced them to trust, to fight, to adapt. And now, these cubs were learning what it meant to move forward, to carry the memory of fear without letting it define them. As twilight deepened, Cole finally turned back toward his cabin. The forest hummed softly, alive with the sounds of renewal. He knew he'd come back to this spot again, maybe to study, maybe to remember. But tonight, he simply wanted to rest and let the story settle where it belonged, in his bones. He paused one last time before leaving the clearing, looking toward the shadows where the bears had vanished. "Take care of them," he murmured, unsure if he was speaking to the forest or something greater. The wind moved through the trees, gentle, almost like a reply. The next few days brought a hush over the valley, as if the land itself was recovering. The river, once wild and furious, now ran smooth and steady, reflecting a sky brushed with muted silver. Ranger Cole spent those mornings checking trails, repairing washed-out markers, and recording notes about erosion and animal movement. Everything looked peaceful again, but deep down he felt that peace differently now. He couldn't stop thinking about the grizzly family. Every snapped twig, every print in the mud reminded him of them. It was strange how their presence lingered, not as fear or danger, but as a quiet companionship he carried within. He knew he shouldn't interfere further, yet something in him wanted to be sure they were safe, especially after what they'd endured. One cold morning, as fog crawled low along the riverbanks, he found what he was looking for, faint paw prints leading from the trees toward a clearing near the far ridge. The cub's smaller tracks ran beside the mother's larger ones, all heading toward higher ground. A sign of survival. A sign of strength. Cole followed the trail until it vanished near a cluster of fir trees. That's where he saw them again, the mother grizzly resting beneath the boughs, her cubs curled beside her like soft brown stones. They were asleep, breathing slow, steady, unbothered by his distant presence. He stayed far enough not to disturb them, but close enough to feel the warmth of recognition. And for the first time in a long while, Cole allowed himself to simply watch. Not as a ranger, not as a scientist, but as a man humbled by what he'd witnessed, the raw, quiet resilience of life itself. A soft rumble of thunder rolled in from the west, deep and low. Cole looked up. The horizon had darkened, the light dimming fast. Another storm was approaching. He stood still, the instinct to warn them rising, even though he knew nature needed no instruction. The mother grizzly lifted her head too, nose twitching at the air, reading the wind just as he did. There was no panic in her this time, Only alertness, the calm of one who had learned what water can take and what it can give back. She nudged her cubs gently, urging them toward a more sheltered hollow beneath the rock ledges. Cole watched as they moved, methodical, certain. He smiled faintly, they didn't need him anymore. He turned to head back before the rain began, but something in the air shifted. The wind picked up suddenly, and the first drops of rain slapped against his jacket. Within minutes, the storm came alive again, not as violent as before but steady and cold. He found himself caught halfway back to the cabin, his boots sinking into soft mud, the forest around him whispering with rain. Then, through the curtain of water, he saw them again, the grizzlies now standing at the mouth of their shelter watching the rain fall. The cubs peeked out curiously, letting a few drops hit their noses before retreating. Cole stopped, frozen by the sight. It wasn't dramatic or heroic this time, just simple, beautiful endurance. He realized something then: the storm didn't just belong to the wild. It belonged to him too. The fear, the fight, the calm after. They were all shared rhythms, parts of the same world breathing under the same sky. When the rain finally softened, Cole lifted his face toward it, feeling the coolness on his skin. He smiled, not because it was easy but because he finally understood the lesson nature had been trying to teach him since that day at the river. Coexistence isn't built in safety. It's forged in survival. As he trudged back through the wet path, his radio crackled, static and faint voices calling from the ranger outpost. "Cole, you there? Heard the storm hit your sector again. You all right?" He pressed the button, eyes still on the ridgeline where the bears had disappeared. "Yeah," he said softly. "All good here." There was a pause. "Find anything worth reporting?" Cole hesitated, glancing once more at the misty forest. "Yeah," he said at last. "Something worth remembering." The static hummed back and then silence. He walked the rest of the way without hurry, each step sinking into soft earth. The forest no longer felt like a boundary to patrol, it felt like home. And somewhere behind him, hidden among the trees, a family of bears was learning the same truth. Storms pass, rivers calm, and every crossing changes you, quietly, forever. Days passed, and the valley settled into a rhythm of quiet normalcy. The river had receded, leaving smooth stones and driftwood in its wake, and the forest seemed to exhale, recovering from its ordeal. Ranger Cole moved through it with careful familiarity, boots crunching on pine needles, notebook in hand, eyes scanning for movement. But he found himself looking not just for signs of erosion or wildlife patterns, but for them, the grizzly family that had taught him more than any manual ever could. It was early morning when he first noticed it, a faint rustle, low and deliberate, coming from the edge of the clearing near the old river bend. He froze. The mother grizzly emerged slowly, stepping from behind a cluster of firs, her cubs trailing obediently. Their fur was still damp from the night's dew, glistening in the soft light of dawn. But what caught his breath wasn't the sight of them, it was the calm, watchful way they moved, as if the valley itself had acknowledged them as rightful inhabitants. Cole paused, unsure whether to approach or retreat. For weeks, he had carried the memory of the river, the torrent, the fall, and the lesson it had impressed on him: trust, patience, and respect. He knew the mother would not approach him, nor did she need to. Yet something in the way she lifted her head and sniffed the air suggested a silent acknowledgement, a recognition of the human who had risked everything to give her cubs a chance. The cubs played cautiously, rolling over soft moss, testing their balance and practicing the skills they would need for survival. One stumbled and tumbled toward the river's edge and Cole's heart leapt. But the mother's gaze cut across the clearing, sharp and precise. The cub froze mid-step, a flicker of obedience and instinct replacing fear. Cole watched, realizing that in a strange, unexpected way, he had become a guardian too, not by authority but by presence. His earlier fears, his adrenaline-soaked decisions at the waterfall, had transformed into a calm vigilance. He was no longer just a human in the wilderness. He had become part of its quiet order. As he moved along the trail to give them space, he noticed how the cubs mirrored the river's lessons. They tested, retreated, recalculated, tiny echoes of the crossings and falls that had defined their first weeks in the wild. The mother guided them with gentle nudges, not threats, and every motion told a story of survival, of learned patience, of trust earned rather than demanded. Cole paused near a moss-covered boulder, notebook in hand, and began jotting observations. He wrote about their paths, their interactions, their tentative explorations. But more than science, he wrote about connection, the fragile bridge between species, forged in shared risk and understanding. Hours slipped by, the sun climbing higher. The valley remained silent but alive, a living testament to the endurance of both man and nature. And though the ranger knew he would have to leave soon, to report back to return to duties, he felt the weight of something more permanent. A subtle movement at the far ridge caught his eye. The mother had paused, ears perked as if sensing something unseen. The cubs mirrored her, all eyes forward, bodies tense. And then, almost imperceptibly, she glanced toward Cole, her dark eyes meeting his. For a heartbeat there was no threat, no hierarchy, just a shared understanding. Survival, respect, and the lessons learned together. Cole lowered himself onto a nearby rock, heart steadying. The storm, the river, the falls, they had all passed. And yet, the valley would never be the same. Neither would he. The cubs tumbled once more into playful wrestling, and the mother watched over them like a sentinel, every muscle poised yet relaxed. It was a scene that felt eternal, a silent promise that the lessons of the river and the first winter were not forgotten. Cole turned back toward the trail, ready to leave, but a sudden rustle in the trees suggested someone, or something, had been watching them both all along. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the western ridges, casting long golden shadows across the river valley. Ranger Cole packed up his gear for the last time before heading back to the outpost. The damp chill of the forest had faded into the warmth of evening, but the memory of cold water, treacherous rocks, and trembling cubs still lingered, alive in his muscles and heart. He paused at the river's edge, looking across at the place where the mother grizzly and her cubs had first tested the torrent. The current had calmed, the mist dissipated, yet in that quiet shimmer of water, Cole could almost see the echoes of the chaos that had brought him here. The cubs, once vulnerable and unsure, now moved with deliberate curiosity, testing each stone along the bank. The mother remained ever watchful, her posture calm but unyielding, the very embodiment of resilience and maternal wisdom. Cole took a deep breath, letting the sounds of the forest fill him. The trickle of the river, the distant caws of birds returning to roost, the soft rustle of wind through the pine. This time he wasn't listening as a ranger evaluating danger. He was listening as a participant, a witness, someone who had been changed by the rhythm of life unfolding around him. He walked along the trail, keeping the family in view. The cubs paused, sniffing the air, then darted toward a shallow pool formed by the river's recent surge. They splashed and rolled, unaware of danger, learning joy and freedom in equal measure. Cole couldn't help but smile. He knew that they had passed a test far larger than the river, the test of trust, patience, and instinct. And yet, for all the distance he maintained, he felt a quiet bond. The mother grizzly glanced at him as if acknowledging his presence, not with recognition of humanity, but with recognition of shared endurance. It was a look that would remain with him always, a reminder that even in the wildest, most untamed corners of the world, connections could form. Cole stopped at a fallen log near the bank, sitting for a moment. He opened his notebook one last time, pen poised. What could he write that would capture the lessons of the river, the storm, the cubs' first trials, and the mother's unwavering strength? He wrote slowly, deliberately. The world tests all of us. Some fail, some endure. But those who endure, humans or bears, do so with trust, courage, and respect. And sometimes that endurance teaches more than any manual ever could. He closed the notebook, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the treetops in gold. The cubs bounded toward their mother, tumbling in play, learning the ways of the wild that would shape them for the rest of their lives. The mother nudged them gently, guiding them silently, teaching without words, shaping without fear. Cole rose, brushing mud and leaves from his clothes. He knew he would leave the valley soon, return to reports and patrols, to boundaries defined by maps and regulations. But he would carry this lesson with him. The lesson of the river, the cubs, the storm, and the quiet, unwavering guardianship of a mother grizzly. As he stepped onto the trail leading back to his vehicle, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. The forest held its breath, the river shimmered, and in the shadows of the trees, a family of bears thrived, forever changed by the crossing that had defined their first winter. A soft smile tugged at Cole's lips. Nature had tested him, risked him, and ultimately trusted him. He felt the weight of that trust like a hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. And though he would return to human life, he knew one thing for certain. The lesson that stayed, about courage, resilience, and the quiet strength of family, would never fade. Cole turned and walked away, leaving the valley behind, but carrying its heart within him.